Hello, everybody. We have very exciting guests for all of you today. We have Heather Hying and Bret Weinstein of the DarkHorse Podcast. They're here to discuss their brand new book, A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, Evolution and the Challenges of Modern Life. We got into a lot of fun stuff. Give the people a preview, Marshall.
Yeah, this is a good break for us. We've been doing a lot of really tactical, strategic focused stuff on the war on terror, withdrawal from Afghanistan. So this was a good chance to take a step back and talk about the more idea side of things we're interested in. So their book is all about how the 21st century modernity is driving all of us completely crazy. Bret and I get in a bit of a debate about how crazy we're actually going, but the overall thesis is really interesting. And they're bringing their academic and scientific backgrounds into it to look at what can we learn from evolution and the way we've been developing and adapting as a species, as societies to all these different problems. So a lot of really great stuff here. Bret Weinstein and Heather Hying, welcome to the Realignment.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
It's really great to see you guys.
Congratulations on the book launch. I get the publication list for the upcoming year a while back, so I was excited to see your book, but I was unclear of how we were going to wrangle evolutionary biology, sociology, psychology into our more modern day politics theme. But I got the Audible book this morning, which I really recommend to everyone. The two of you both read it. It's a fun time, especially if you're listeners to this podcast and their podcast, Dark Horse. But you made clear that this is a book about modernity and the various ways that the 21st century, our specific existence, is really speeding up and also causing us to all go a little crazy, which is basically what we're talking about for Realignment. So I think that we can pull this together nicely. Let's just open from the two of you. What is your argument? How does it relate to your background? How did this all tie together?
Well, I want to correct you first. We're not going a little crazy. We're just going crazy. It's it's not even subtle anymore. And the reason has to do with what we call hyper-novelty. Hyper-novelty being a state in which the rate of change that we face as modern technological humans outpaces our capacity to adapt as evolutionary beings. And it's hard to say exactly when we cross that threshold, but we are clearly well over it now. And it is deranging us. It is making us sick physically, socially, psychologically, and it's putting us in great danger.
So we make the argument in the book, and this is not new if you're accustomed to thinking evolutionarily, that we bring with us into the present all of our history. And we resemble the least the things that represent what we were the longest ago. So we were hunter-gatherers, all of us, on the African savanna 200,000 years ago, let's call it. But we are almost all of us also agriculturalists, more like 10,000 years ago. And we've got 10,000, all of us pretty much have 10 to 12,000 years of farming in our backgrounds. And all of us have 100 plus years of post-industrial life in our backgrounds as well. So all of those inform who we are and what we are. And, we can go farther back, which would be less obviously a fit for this conversation for your show, right? We can talk about, our primate heritage and our mammalian heritage and our fishy heritage and our animalian heritage. And of course, we recognize things about those aspects of our history. We have bones and we have brains and we're endothermic and all of these, and we have opposable thumbs and all of these things are true, but it's the rate of change that we are creating for ourselves that is so unique to both us and to this moment. And luckily for us, we got ourselves into this mess, but we think we can probably get ourselves out.
Well, I want to make sure that we get there. But one thing, Heather, I'm curious just to follow up a little bit there, which is that given our past organizational structures, could you kind of lay us out what is so different about our current want to organize ourselves kind of in the nation state sense, like post Westphalia 1648, than the agriculturalists of 2,000 years ago? 5,000 years ago and more. What exactly is hyper novelty of the current organization politically? I don't mean democracy, system of government. I mean just like literally the way that humans are trying to govern themselves today, as opposed to what we might be more used to.
I guess I would say, and this has already been implied in what both Bret and I have said, is that it is not so much a particular thing, a particular way of organizing ourselves, but the rate of change itself, that is itself changing so rapidly that even with us being, as we argue in the book, those most able to adapt to change of any organisms on the planet, even we can't keep up. So it's the rate of change itself that we see accelerating throughout human history, but accelerating at a nearly exponential rate starting in the 1800s and accelerating so fast today.
Mm-hmm. I'd love to actually get a definition of the post-industrial age. I think we have a specific image of hunter-gatherer societies. We understand agricultural societies. Because as we're thinking to the solutions part of this, which we'll hopefully get to, I'm thinking, okay, so is the post-industrial age, is it the internet? Is it going to space? Is it the movement to the cities that's in the 1800s? Let's just define that part there.
Well, there's a danger in trying to define it. We'll define it so narrowly, it'll be useless. But I would point to this. We have, as human beings and really as evolved creatures, a built-in tendency to obsess over that which can be done better. So almost every ancestor that any of us have had did not have enough food. And that meant that preserving calories that had already been found was as useful as finding new ones. So there is this kind of obsession with figuring out where we are being inefficient and fixing the process. It's a very good instinct, but it runs amok. And so what we have is a world in which various things have combined. We have an economic system, we have technology, we have a division of labor in which people can be very specialized on tiny little fractions of a computer program or a mechanism. And it has resulted in a runaway process in which we do solve problems left and right. But what we don't do is recognize that each of those solutions carries a danger of unintended consequences. And so when we do something like introduce a smartphone into the world, it's very easy to see what problems it solves. It is not so easy to see how it is going to derange us. And in fact, it's hard to quantify. We all understand that there's something about the world of Twitter and Instagram and the other social media platforms being present all the time. We have no Sabbath in which we put this down as a people and remind ourselves what it's like to be non-technological humans. We're suddenly plugged into this new way of contacting each other. And I think it would be uncontroversial to say it has made us quicker to anger. It has made us less nuanced overall. It has caused us to polarize in ways that are both familiar and novel. And the point is, the very natural and ancient tendency to try to do things better runs away when it gets enough power to solve small enough problems that suddenly the world is new every decade.
Mm-hmm. If I might add, actually, I'm not sure you will agree with this, but as you were talking, it occurred to me that in terms of trying to define post-industrialism without locking ourselves into something that will become dated very quickly, we talk in the final chapter of the book about three kinds of historical frontiers that humans have faced, and we talk about the need for a fourth. And very briefly, they will be recognizable to everyone. They are geographic frontiers, such as the Beringians entering the New World, something between 10 and 25,000 years ago, a world that had previously had no human beings in it. There are technological frontiers in which you make more with something that previous people could not make much of. So, for instance, the terracing of hillsides so that you can preserve water and the water does not run down the hillsides, but you can irrigate crops. And then the third type of historical frontier is really not a legitimate frontier at all. It's a form of theft, which is the transfer of resource frontier. So, for instance, Francisco Pizarro coming to the New World from the other direction and finding actually a landscape filled with 100 million people. So of those three kinds of frontiers, humans have been engaging all of them throughout time. And it seems like the post-industrial era is one in which technological frontiers have specifically accelerated much more quickly. And, obviously there continue to be transfer of resource frontiers. They're illegitimate, they're immoral. We need to minimize them, as much as possible. But effectively at the point of 1850 or so, call it, for the origins of industrialization, most of the geographic frontiers were over. We'd already been there and done that. Some humans had been there and done that. And so it was an increase specifically in that second type of frontier that we began to see. Would you agree with that framing?
Yeah, I think, transfer of resource is very ancient. We see it everywhere. It doesn't require that the planet has filled up with populations, but there is something about the end of the age of exploration where there is nowhere new to go. And that means that what there is to be done to access the thing that evolution points us towards is better ways of doing things. So, farming is an improvement on hunting and gathering from the point of view of the amount of resource that it extracts from a given patch of territory. Being able to terrace hillsides adds more farmable land. So there's just a bias in terms of figuring out what we're not yet doing that we might extract some growth from. And as that becomes increasingly technological, we become increasingly remote from the habitats for which we are most adapted.
One of the things I think is most important about the book is it actually lines up with a lot of what we're trying to do here. Somebody will say to us, what do you think about X political problem or like X political controversy? And we'll say, well, that's not really what you should be thinking about. What you should be thinking about is, how should I think about that? What are some past examples that we can incorporate into the way that we might think that this one political event might fit into a broader trend and might then inform how you might see one thing or another. In other words, it's both a system, but also having the mental capacity in order to sift through it is important. And that's what comes through very much in the book, is the toolkit itself. So when we're looking at our hyper-novel sociological problems, and since you're both of your experience in the classroom, I think this is where it comes most important. Can you lay out for our audience, when they're confronting a hyper-novel situation, or they don't even know that they're in a hyper-novel situation, what are some of the thought processes they can incorporate in order to try and think better about the problems that they're facing or they're seeing?
Yeah, great question. Let me just say before you start riffing, Bret, that the way that you introduced that question reminded me exactly very much of what we're trying to do here. And I think a sort of a third way of thinking about this is with regard to how we deal with medical diagnoses. Would you prefer to have your symptoms treated, or would you prefer a diagnosis that understands the underlying causes and allows you to potentially deal with the problem so that it doesn't become chronic? And obviously, framed that way, absent all of the other costs and benefits that might be involved, you prefer diagnosis, and yet we're moving into a landscape of ever greater short-term symptom alleviation rather than diagnosis and long-term health.
Yeah, that's very much the direction I would go as well. There's a tool that we used to deploy with students where we would talk about the fact that there were lots of problems that you could understand something about, but you didn't really understand what they were till you figured out where to stand. And for us, if you've ever seen anamorphic art, sometimes you'll see, for example, these elaborate chalk drawings that people will put on the ground that look like some giant chasm has opened in the city and there are floating rocks and things like this. Well, what you may or may not realize is that it only looks like that from one place. The artist, the way they get the depth out of those pictures is by knowing exactly where you will stand and distorting the object so that your brain interprets everything as three-dimensional. You can look at these paintings from any angle and they look crazy. They look distorted and warped and stretched. And so
just to be clear, this is quite literally a point where if you stand in the wrong place, you cannot make sense of the world that you are asked to make sense of.
You can make some sense, but you can't make as much sense as you would like. And so very often your instinct is exactly right. You may be able to say something about a puzzle like, why do our teeth tend to come in not very straight, or why do so many of us wear glasses, these sorts of things. But until you've understood that there's actually a level that has nothing to do with your teeth or your eyes, there's a higher level that actually explains both of those puzzles and a dozen others like it, you don't really know how to address it. And so we are literally treating these maladies symptomatically rather than recognizing, wait a minute, If you properly understood these things, you would realize that every child who goes on to have to wear glasses or to need braces or to need anxiety medications has suffered an injury somewhere in development that has then caused some problem that needs to be treated medically. And that the obvious thing to do is to try to figure out how not to cause those problems rather than how to correct them later.
In part, the logic being, when was the last time you saw a hyena that needed glasses or braces or anxiety medication? And no, we're not hyenas, but we are evolved beings who not so long ago actually shared a habitat with them. And I could have picked any organism on the planet, right? That the example that Bret's been using is you stand on the street corner of any American city and you just watch people go by, and the number of pathologies that you see that are actually visible to the naked eye are extraordinary. Whereas you stand somewhere in the Amazon, in the rainforest, and you don't see visible pathologies in the same way. So that suggests that modernity is making us sick. And there is much that modernity has done for us. There is much that we are gaining from it. This is not an either-or position. Not a traditional view. We need to go back, not regression, but not simply a view of anything that looks like the future is positive, because obviously there are many possible futures that would not be good for all of us.
So I want to correct one thing, not really correct, but refine one thing that I know our detractors will come after us for if we don't point it out, which is that there are two reasons that you don't see pathology if you're standing in a rainforest and looking at creatures. One is that there's much less pathology because it's caused less frequently because they don't have a hypernovelty problem. The other is that selection tends to eliminate things that have been made dysfunctional by such things. So both those things contribute, but we are no doubt causing a huge amount of dysfunction at every level, right up to societal level. We are causing dysfunction because we are not thinking, as you say, about the problem in the correct manner.
Mm-hmm. It's so funny that you interjected with that, Bret, because my actual follow-up question was going to be along those lines. So let me just rescue the follow-up real quick. Are you alleging that modernity, this is to you then, Heather, is actually increasing the amount of pathology? Because obviously, let's say we're human beings 200,000 years ago. The obvious point people are thinking is, well, if you're nearsighted, you'd be eaten by the hyena. If you have crooked teeth, they get infected, you die, this, or that. Are you then saying what's unique about our current moment is that the pathologies are actually increasing? And what then are you alleging is going on there?
So yes, in part. It's not as clean a story with myopia, with vision. I at least have not seen the research, but the prediction is that it's going to look very much like the story with our teeth, for instance. So you look at pre-industrial people's skulls, for which we have some number of collections, and you don't see malocclusion. You don't see jaws that don't fit together. You don't see crooked and falling out teeth the way that we have in the modern world. The vision that we have in our heads is one of, well, basically nasty, brutish, and short lives, right? In which civilization is the only thing that we can seek that can then lift us out of that hellscape. But in fact, it is aspects of the modern landscape, and certainly not all of it, but aspects of the modern landscape that are creating some of the pathologies that we are then treating with other aspects of modernity. And we are then in a cycle in which we've got something modern being treated with something else modern. And in those cases, with things like braces required for jaws that were malformed because of some combination of too soft foods as infants and artificial nipples. Like literally, those are like the two things that created the raft of malocclusion and the need for orthodontia in modern times. Well, how about we encourage harder foods and breastfeeding and see if we don't get a fix that doesn't require moving around our teeth as teenagers, which then causes more problems down the road.
This doesn't mean that the net effect of modernity is negative. There are measures which are clearly positive. For example, lifespan. Human lifespan, maximal human lifespan has not changed at all, but average human lifespan has gone up dramatically as a result of a number of things. Most importantly, a reduction in infant mortality, the development of things like antibiotics and vaccines that have reduced infectious disease and its impacts. But it doesn't mean that the level of health for an individual has gone up universally. The number of pathologies has gone up, and needlessly so. The fact is, your teeth being disorganized is actually itself a symptom of another pathology. It's effectively the collapse of facial structures that are supposed to take on their shape in response to inputs that come as information, right? As you bite down on harder foods, it puts information into your jaws. And in the absence of that information, you get this collapsing of the palate, and then there's not enough room for the teeth, and they become disorganized, trying to solve an unsolvable problem. But it is worth noting also, though, that it is still true, even though this story has become quite clear as a result actually of a tiny number of people's hard work, the field of orthodontia still pretends that the explanation is somehow a proliferation of bad genes. You get bad luck, it puts your teeth in a disorganized order, and we need to fix them by moving them through your jaws. And the amount of harm done because we don't think, wait a minute, how could we prevent that condition from arising, is immense. But you can also see the perverse incentive, right? The field of orthodontia doesn't necessarily want to realize that it could be reduced to a tiny fraction of its current size if we gave children the right foods and didn't put rubber things in their mouths when they were babies.
So one of the things that moderns know is likely a problem is the safetyism that is spreading throughout our institutions, right? That on college campuses and such. I would argue, and we don't do this exactly in these words in the book, but that there's been a safetyism since the Industrial Revolution, really, that it imagines that humans are fragile rather than anti-fragile. And to be anti-fragile means not just that it's fine if you experience stressors, but that you actually become stronger with the experience of stressors. So this is true not just of our brains and our muscles and our bones, but absolutely everything. And so everything from the medical practice of literally putting a cast on any single bone that you break that's a long bone and immobilizing it completely for 6 weeks, through protecting your children from all injury or risk, be it physical or emotional or intellectual, until they're 18, these things make us weaker. These things create the pathologies of modernity. And why don't we instead pick and choose with an evolutionary lens among those modern interventions that actually allow us to be stronger, to reveal our own anti-fragility and make progress as we move into the future?
I'm really glad that you brought up safetyism, because one of the things, and this has also just been mind-blowing for me, like on a personal level, like whenever I read James Nestor's book, Breath, and I was like, why am I breathing through my mouth? You're not supposed to do, it's like, this is something that people literally knew. It was a Native American, article of faith, like moms closing their babies' mouths while they were sleeping. And they even, some guy who visited the American frontier in the 1830s wrote a whole book about it. It's like such forgotten knowledge, and it literally changes the way that your entire face looks. He did the same thing. He went and looked at skulls. The problem that I always see whenever we start to talk this way is you can see teeth. You're exactly right. Like, everybody knows, they're like, there's no way that humankind for all of its existence has had messed up teeth. There's just no way that would have worked. Same with vision, same with our face, same with obesity, a whole host of these types of things. But what about when we start to talk about sociologically and the way that we organize ourselves? What are some of the modernity, kind of manifesting pathologies that we see, which we may not even be aware of? Social media, I think, is the most obvious one, but there's also just people at scale, people who are voting. That's actually a pretty novel and new concept. Deciphering information, electing a leader on the basis of maybe policy, maybe, and selecting for things that may be useful now, which were never useful in the past. I'd love to hear both of you talk about that.
Well, the first thing to realize is that the product of this hyper-novel world is arbitrary. It's not that it's bad. Sometimes it's great, and sometimes it's a disaster, and often it's somewhere in between with parts that go in different directions. There are many things about this. I mean, even in this last year and a half, we have watched people who have interacted electronically figure out how to use Zoom for all kinds of things they would have done in person before. Is this good? Well, it's probably far better than email, for example. The amount of personal connection that you can actually get through a Zoom call is not bad. Is it the replacement for in-person interaction? Almost certainly not. And there are certain things missing from it. But the point is, it's a good and a bad story. But what we're dealing with overarchingly is that whatever it is that we once did has lost its coherence. So there used to be certain feedbacks. For example, if you behaved the way you behave on Twitter in your own community, you would be ostracized. And probably you wouldn't get around to being ostracized, because as you began to do this and you discovered your prospects dried up because nobody wanted to be around you, you'd learn to stop doing it. And so you'd end up being nicer. And the problem is that some things that are absolutely essential require us to return to a system that has that coherence. So we have things called tragedies of the commons. Tragedies of the commons are places where some sort of common resource is destroyed as a result of the fact that individuals have no capacity to prevent their destruction and a lot of control over whether or not they profit from that destruction. And so they collectively decide to do something that destroys the resource. But in ancestral circumstances, it wasn't like this, because for one thing, if you, for example, had a population of fish from which you drew your sustenance every year, you had an interest in that population of fish being healthy. Yes. If you're an industry that takes advantage of that same population of fish, it may be that effectively you can liquidate it and walk away with those profits and then invest it in the next resource and destroy that one. And because it's many different conglomerates coming together over this resource, we destroy one after the other. Now, in ancient times, people had belief systems that prevented them from doing this. This is the work of Elinor Ostrom, who discovered all of the mechanisms that populations have discovered for preventing the destruction of that on which they depend. And we, of course, need those very same things. But the only process we have by which we could bootstrap it is now compromised by corruption to a level that it simply doesn't get done. And for us not to be terribly frightened of the prospect of destroying our own planet right under our feet is evidence that we're not yet standing in the right place to see that puzzle.
Something I'm curious about as we're discussing all of these issues along an evolutionary line is, can you talk about evolution's usage as a framework, as a mental approach to problems in society in like the late 19th and then mid 20th century? So obviously evolution isn't what literally gives you Hitler and eugenics, all these different policies, but that was very much a world where in the 1920s, people were saying, hey, we have this worldview, evolution, which is not, evolution has no opinion. It's not a thing. It's a process, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Can you all just talk about what you all as scientists and people who are academics have really, not just the two of you, but the whole broader like scientific community has learned about using evolution as a framework, as an approach to problems, in contrast to what happened 100 years ago with all that stuff?
Yeah, there's a lot to say. And too much of what is understood about evolution in modern social science, in fields like anthropology and sociology, imagine that those errors of interpretation are actually what Darwinism is. And so we're living still with the misapprehension of what evolution is, and it helps feed the fear that an evolutionary approach is actually a cryptic, racist, sexist, homophobic, whatever it is approach, and it's not. So one of the answers is eugenics, social Darwinism, which is not Darwinism. These are misunderstandings which imagine that however it is that you are gauging the top thing at the moment, the fittest, survival of the fittest, is not just that you are correct in understanding what the fittest is, which certainly when that's applied to wealth, it's applied as if you are wealthy, you have already demonstrated that you're the fittest, and therefore you should continue to be the fittest. So wealth is a very poor proxy of fitness, first of all. But more to the point, it imagines a staticness to what natural selection is, that Darwin would have been the first to tell you was a misunderstanding. Everything in evolution is context dependent, which is to say environment dependent. So what is fit today may not be fit tomorrow, may not be fit with someone else in some other context, with some other, population, individual, protein, right? The context is all of those things at all of those scales simultaneously. And so if you succeed now, that does not mean that what you are is something that is destined to succeed, nor should it. And so I guess one more point before you pick this up, Bret. We always made an explicit point, and we do in the book too, but in our programs when we were college professors, on day one of pointing out the naturalistic fallacy, which is to believe that what is what ought to be. And so when we are trying to understand the past and what evolutionary processes made us what we are today, we are trying to understand what evolution is and what has been. But there is nothing in that, that science, that storytelling, that scientific storytelling, all three of those things, that tells us anything about what we should be doing or what we ought to aspire to. And it is that naturalistic fallacy, that conflation of what is with what ought to be, that is in some ways at the core of errors in thinking like social Darwinism and eugenics.
So I'm going to take a slightly different tack. I should warn you, should probably sit down. This is not the answer that people want. So when Heather talks about the fact that social Darwinism is bad Darwinism, she's talking about the analytical framework. The fact is the underlying evolutionary structure does cause these bad dynamics. It does produce phenomena like Hitler. It produces genocide and racism as lineages compete against each other and they profit by excluding each other. And until we realize that, we won't be able to halt the process. The most important thing to realize is that gene-based cooperation is the most basic form of cooperation to evolve. It is not the most useful. And the problem is that we have better reciprocal altruism and indirect reciprocity and all of the things stacked on top of it they create a much better world for all of us. And those of us who have participated in that cosmopolitan world know it. We like it. We don't want to cooperate with people based on how closely related to them we happen to be. It's better to cooperate across these lineage lines. The problem is if we allow certain competitive dynamics to unfold, we break down into that structure. And one of the things that people like us have been saying about these current trends, cancel culture and wokeness and all of this, is that they are in fact taunting that very beast, that they are kicking that hornet's nest. And what they're going to cause to happen is a breakdown in this better, higher quality cooperation environment into this much lesser, more brutal gene-based cooperation environment. And it's a disaster. There doesn't seem to be any way to warn them to stop doing this. They do not listen, but really they must. Otherwise, we're going to end up back in a very familiar place that none of us want to go.
It's interesting thinking about that part in particular, because what you're saying is that what creates a better environment is not necessarily the best thing that was selected for over time. So what are some mechanisms, and I guess we're starting to get more to the solutions, what are some mechanisms, mindsets, and more that we might be able to incorporate to incentivize those behaviors, both at an individual and a societal level, to create better outcomes?
One of the things I would say is to recognize that there are places in our lives where we already do this, where we already ignore the short-term benefit because we can recognize that long-term, there is greater everything. There is greater love, enjoyment, productivity, creativity, passion, just pleasure even. So junk food already has a name. And we know that we can train our bodies and our minds to actually crave food that is both good for us and utterly delicious, right? We can, therefore, train our bodies and our minds to crave the non-junk versions of all of this. It's tough, and there will be slippage, and it will be particularly hard if the people around you are still addicted to the junk versions of food, of sex, of entertainment, of politics, whatever it is. But it can be done, and it actually brings not just more well-being, but more pleasure as well. And so, at that point, at the point that you discover, oh, this steak with this like salad and roasted vegetables that have caramelized sugars in them because this is real food that was slow cooked over a real fire. This is extraordinary, and I far prefer it to the Big Mac. That is a moment that can happen with each of these domains.
I think there is a liberation that comes from having a robust, simple model of what you are and how it interfaces with the world that you live in. And this is in large measure what motivated us to write the book. Our students talked to us about the model that we were teaching them and what it had done for them. And there was a frustration that many of them had that they couldn't hand the model off to other people so easily. It took months of working through pieces of it and seeing how it applied. So the best thing we can do is we can recognize that there is such a model, right? Our book is an invitation to what we call campfire, and it is an invitation to a discussion about what this robust model of what we are might look like. And then we must extrapolate from it. And the hope is that, I don't know how to put this gently, but that as you pick this up, you become less of a sucker, right? We are being sold very poor explanations for where we are and what it implies about what we must do. It has us unnaturally suspicious of each other. It has us in a state of ill health and insecurity. It is causing us to be hyper fragile, not just failing to be anti-fragile, but we are in a state where small things can go wrong with large cascading effects. Once you begin to see it, and you realize that actually the route out are very simple things like the precautionary principle and its inverse, Chesterton's fence. These two principles allow you to recognize that actually change is often great, but believing in change for its own sake is a fool's paradise. This is what's putting us in danger and making us unhealthy and frankly making us miserable. So the recognition that there's a better way and it doesn't involve becoming the master of some very complex set of insights. It's actually a simplifying, intuitive way of looking at the world is at least the first step.
Something, and quick note for people who are watching audio, they have an adorable cat which keeps popping up, and you're missing all of us occasionally smiling as that goes on. But my actual question is the following. I'm going back to your correction at the start of the episode, Bret, that it's not merely that we're going a little crazy, which was my wording, but you said we are going completely crazy. And the mock trial high school prosecutor in me wants to push you to prove the case a little more, because we're talking about Twitter, and let's be real for a second. People with problematic Twitter behavior, that's 0.0001% of the population. For us, it feels like it's everything, but it's really just not everything. So Twitter is definitely crazy. All sorts of craziness at college. I don't have to educate either of you about that, but the reality is most people don't even go to college. So let's just take a step back and just get a real accounting of the ways that the 21st century are driving us truly crazy.
Okay, so let me defend my case.
It's a great framing.
Okay, I don't know if either of you were paying attention to the last election, but
never.
we
had to.
We actually had a contest between these two decrepit clowns, right? Clearly, neither of them an appropriate answer to the question of how are we to govern ourselves in a complex era with incredibly powerful weapons pointed at each other, novel dangers around every corner, a pandemic in mid-trajectory. How is it that our system that is supposed to work through things by us discussing what we should do and then naming those who are best positioned to do it, how is it that that system produced that matchup? And my answer would be everything about it is broken. Okay, now broken doesn't make us crazy. The brokenness has a lot to do with corruption. But here's the question. How is it we did not intuit the danger implied by a system that would dare inflict that choice on us, right? We have a danger as human beings. We could elect excellent people. We would still have an existential threat to our continued ability to inhabit this planet. It would be live for us every day by virtue of the complexity of our system and the various hazards that threaten us. So we ought to be demanding that we have the most incredibly capable people put before us as a choice. And even then we should be frightened that it's not enough. Instead, we have a circus. So I think that the case for us being crazy is actually a slam dunk. We would not let this happen, and we would be demanding better choices if we were not nuts.
Sorry, go ahead, Heather.
Well, one of the themes that we return to frequently in the book is that of reductionism, that our supposedly scientific way of understanding the world, the weird world scientific way of understanding the world is effectively a very reductionist scientific view, one in which we identify complex systems, we find one thing that's easily measurable, easily quantifiable. We start measuring it, we start quantifying it, we produce those numbers for people, and they say, got it. I've got the one metric that matters for this complex system. And the very nature of complex systems is that having one measurable variable is not going to fully explain nor fix that system. And so if we apply in the book how about we try to do an emergent, which is largely an evolutionary understanding of complex systems across all of these domains. And just, we could walk through, but, we have in the book that misunderstanding, this reductionist approach to all of the following systems, and we try to look at it through the emergent lens of evolution, health and medicine and food, as we've already talked about here some, and sleep, sex and gender, relationship and parenthood, childhood, school, various aspects of adulthood, and of course, society-wide issues. So in all of those cases, we can point to, here's the thing that's been identified as if we just cure that one simple metric, we can solve it. In the 80s, for food, it was, people are eating too much fat. Well, it turns out that was simply wrong, right? Mm-hmm. And what that allowed was then a reversal of what actually should have been happening. And suddenly people are eating a whole lot of simple carbs, which directly contributed to the epidemic of obesity and metabolic disorders that we've got now, right? So it's these simple metrics that are mistaken for complete answers when applied to systems. And then really, and we talk about this in the school chapter quite a bit, the assumption, it's such a complicated world now that most people would like some set and forget answers for some things. We need some set and forget things that we don't have to reanalyze every time we go to the store. Which brand of toilet paper am I going to get now? Who am I going to vote for? It's everything, across that entire gamut. But we are getting too many things that come in the form that sound like, here's the science. Here's what you would do if you were following the science. When in fact, these are conclusions that were come to by maybe scientific means, maybe not, but we aren't shown the process. So to understand complex systems as intelligent human beings, as almost all human beings are, we need to be allowed into the process. We need to be allowed to see, how did you arrive at those conclusions? Let me watch you arrive at those conclusions a few times and see if I actually trust you to come to conclusions. Otherwise, pat sayings like follow the science, sorry, no. You're telling me to come to a conclusion that I wasn't allowed to be a participant in.
Mm-hmm. It's one of the frustrating things that I always think about this is that of course, I want to live this way. I want everybody to live this way, but at scale, I just know that they won't. And so this is, kind of an answer to that question, Bret, is like, how did we end up this way? I'll give you an example. Let's take it out of the current one. I was thinking about this yesterday. I'm like, I cannot believe George W. Bush got reelected president. I just still can't believe it. I was a child whenever it happened. Iraq, such a disaster. And he won the popular vote. And I was thinking, and I was talking about it yesterday, but I'm like, no, but I know exactly how, that happened, which is that people wanted to feel safe. Terrorism was at the top of the list. How exactly Iraq was shaken out was pretty obvious if you were paying like very, very close attention. But if you weren't, it wasn't yet obvious exactly how much of a morass that the entire thing was, plus the candidate. And what I mean by that is, we always talk about most people, the way that they vote is idiosyncratic at best. A lot of it is inherited. A lot of it comes from, I feel as if I can trust that person. The classic is whatever you think about the guy, I'd love to have a beer with him. Obama, an extraordinarily charismatic figure. Trump, he tells it like it is. Biden, he reminds me of my grandpa or whatever. These are like ephemeral, and I'm curious from your guys' view, wasn't that kind of how we would select leaders in the past? And so when we look at that and we apply the evolutionary toolkit, how are we then to try and evolve past it? And again, at scale, when those are so ingrained in our behaviors and our biases.
Well, I don't agree with your description here. I think
sure,
all of these things are downstream of a system in which any real choice is eliminated in the primaries. That's the key thing. And if you can say something positive about Donald Trump, is that he at least proved that system was not so robust that it couldn't be broken through by a true renegade. Now, it happens he wasn't up to the job of being president, but he was, in some sense, maybe the only person up to the job of demonstrating that it was possible for an outsider to get in. And what I'm telling you is that, I think the way leaders get chosen has changed radically, and that this is now a question of marketing, and we are trying not to be suckers, but we fail at it all the time. Your example of us misunderstanding the danger of carbohydrates, especially sugar. Well, that's also downstream of the sugar industry deciding to demonize fat because to a certain mindset, it was intuitive that fat should be the problem because you were trying to avoid becoming fat. But no, this didn't make any sense. Doesn't make any more sense than what orthodontists tell us about why our teeth are crooked, or ophthalmologists tell us about why our eyes are unable to focus properly. So the point is, we've got to get wiser and stop buying these sales pitches, right? George Bush didn't need a very good sales pitch because he didn't have a very good opponent, right? If you had people who were really qualified for this job and they were able to get to a place where we could actually debate their various merits, it would look very different, which is why the system is built the way it is. So we're going to have to confront it at some point.
I agree with most of that, but I didn't really hear the pushback to what Sagar was saying. And I think there are places that markets don't belong is part of what you're saying, which we talk about in the book as well. Other places being things like sex and music probably. But there is this problem of scale. And it's not clear to me, because famously, we started having presidential elections being won by beauty, right? In the 60s, as soon as they were televised. And there's no going back, nor should we want to go back. But there is a lot more conveyed. As much as much as we are seeing each other here, it would be far better to be in a room, the four of us,
yes,
actually sharing all of the things, most of which don't even have words yet in science, most of which we don't even have names for, but that are actually conveyed by being in person with other human beings. The sensory, whether or not we're actually touching each other, but the things that are communicated are greater. And it is more difficult to be confused by other people when you have more inputs, more lines of communication. And so at the point that we have elections that are run entirely through screens, it's going to be easier to confuse people. And I do think that that's actually part of what has been going on for the last 18 months as well, is this, even greater acceleration of confusion and chaos and social decay. It's not just the actual separation, families not being able to get together and such, but we imagine that the Zoom calls are a replacement and they're better than nothing, but they're not a replacement.
Yes.
So the pushback was that I know this is going to sound hard to believe. I actually know people who voted for Joe Biden. Right. That's an amazing fact, given that his mental decline was completely obvious during the campaign, given the absurdity of Hunter Biden selling his father's influence, given the obvious corruption that has characterized the DNC, which was his major supporter. So why would smart people have voted for Joe Biden? They voted for him because, let me tell you about the other guy, right?
Yeah, he hated Trump.
Right. And so the point is, look, is it rational for a person to vote for Donald Trump? No. In the context of a Joe Biden, you can make an argument. Is it rational for people to vote for Joe Biden? No. But in the context of a Donald Trump, you can make an argument. So my point is, we didn't always do this. And the farther you go back, the clearer this actually was. Initially, in the very smallest human bands, there was leadership, but that headman position was not a position of great power. It was actually a burden, right? It was something one accepted. One did not want to be responsible for making the calls that might determine whether or not your group had enough to eat or starve, but you accepted it because it was in everyone's interest to have the best possible person doing that job. So the likelihood of it being done well was the greatest. And this is the mindset that we should be in, right? We want the very best people to be making decisions on our behalf. Frankly, I care less and less about what their ideology is. I care about whether they're clear-headed and can figure out how to navigate, because more or less, we all agree on the basics about what kind of society we want to live in, even though we're told that's not true. Right? Nobody wants to live in a society where one race is privileged because the structures favor it, right? That thinking did exist, but we're all past that. Nobody wants to live in a society where if you feel female, even though you were born in the body of a male, you're forbidden to express yourself in this way. We're all over it, right? We want a fair society. We want a degree of safety. We don't want to be so heavily managed that we're stifled here everywhere we try to go, right? These are all things we agree on. So figuring out who could represent us in the pursuit of those objectives is the real question. And we are instead caught in a game, right? It's a game in which we have our stake is fully invested, but we have essentially no control, right? It's a popularity contest. And that is evidence that we have lost our minds. And not only that, but that our mechanism for figuring out how to generate leadership is novel and not useful.
I'm fascinated by that because we're nearing the end here, so I'm not going to push too much, but my first reaction is I'm not sure I agree with your telling of how leadership worked in ancient tribal hunter-gatherer times, when you said that it was a burden, it wasn't wanted. I guess the part of me, and why I always appreciate talking with the two of you, is the fact that you recognize that labels are weakening and are worse and worse signals. But the part of me that is more philosophically conservative is like, no, like actually humans have always been mixes of fear, desiring of honor, ambition. This is Thucydides. This is, the ancient Greeks, the classics. So I just don't buy that there wasn't within a tribe a caveman, shall we say, who had a little more heart to him and really wanted to be in charge. So can you just speak to what you're getting at there? Because I'm just having a hard time picturing that.
So this is a deep evolutionary puzzle. You will notice that the cells in your eyes do not rebel against the other parts of your body. They don't rebel for a very good reason. The only way for the genes in your eyes to make it into the future is through extremely tight collaboration with every other cell type you've got in your body. There's no disagreement about this in your body. And when something does arise that heads off on its own, we call it cancer, right? Now, a tiny band of humans is not quite as aligned as cells are in your body, but it's got shared fate at a level that we don't intuit because we have never lived this way. We can't even imagine it. But you could bootstrap a narrative in which you would find such a thing, right? Like imagine you're on some great sailing ship and you find yourself on a life raft, and the types of people that you distrust and dislike are on that raft with you together. And you have the choice of either to put your stuff aside and figure out how you're going to survive, right? Or you could fight about your differences right then and there and all perish. The fact is you can get along with almost anybody in that situation. All they need as a prerequisite is the ability to spot the problem, right? Now, you may, at the point you get on shore, see your differences very clearly, or you may have learned something about the humanity of the other person by the time you get there and not act on those things because you're in fact different than you were. But those small groups of humans were very tightly aligned because the ones that weren't didn't leave any descendants.
So I agree with all of that, but I will also agree that there is as much diversity in sort of leadership style and the ways that small bands of people were organized as we see in, say, the ways that children are raised in such societies. It's not, it's not a single type. So in some cases, it's exactly as you describe it. In some cases, the leader did indeed get more wives if it was polygynous society, more food, the first meat, whatever it was. So, highly variable. But the more important point is that there had to be the understanding of shared fate and the behavioral and cultural things in place to make that manifest, else they perished.
So we promised we would get there, and I'm sure people are waiting with bated breath. What are, and I'm sure we've hinted at many of them, what are some of the solutions that you point to within the book to deal with hyper-novelty and to make sure that we can all think with an evolutionary mindset whenever we're confronting these problems that we face?
There are different scales to answer that. So you have a personal scale in which you have to answer the question about what you're going to eat and how you're going to address your sleep issues and how you're going to raise your children.
And how you reframe your own motivational structure.
Yeah, which is key. I mean, this is one of the things we discovered in teaching college students is that very frequently the obstacle to learning has everything to do with what they're wired to accomplish, right?
Yeah.
If you're
carrot
wired,
and stick, not so much.
Yeah,
you have to be internally driven.
If you're wired to please the person at the front of the room, then frankly, you're a born sucker, right? And we don't start out this way. But you need to be able to figure out what to do when there is no person at the front of the room. And you need to figure out, you don't want to be rewarded. You don't want somebody who doesn't know what they're talking about to pat you on the head when you say something, because in fact, what you've said is probably wrong. So you have to break yourself from that framework in order to begin to figure out how things work. What we try to provide in the book is the scaffolding for that new model that simplifies what you have to understand in order to function, uses basic tools like the precautionary principle and Chesterton's fence to say, here are the places where your alarm bells ought to go off. Here are the kinds of things that are liable to carry hazards you can't see. But then there's the question about how we deal with the societal level, which in the last couple of chapters of the book we talk about. And the point is pretty simple. Human beings are the creature best positioned to deal with change. That's what we're built for. The level of change that we currently face is too fast. The rate of change of that rate of change is outstripping our capacity to adapt. We have to fix that problem. And we're going to have to bootstrap a new way of being, which is what human beings have done throughout evolutionary history, which is going to require us to become conscious of what the problems are. And instead of thinking that we can blueprint some solution, which would certainly be a disaster, we're going to have to navigate in the direction of that solution and discover what the structures that we need actually are.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a excellent place to end it. I'm sure we'll find a great excuse to talk about things in the future. I'll drop a breadcrumb. I'm really interested in a further discussion on corruption and the role it plays in ideas, but I'm going to be merciful with everyone's time and say we will hit that next year, hopefully. So just the quick thing, the book is out today. Would love just to get the full list of things everyone should look at and all the great stuff y'all are working on.
All right.
Yeah. So here it is. It's a hunter-gatherer's guide to the 21st century, evolution and the challenges of modern life. It is out today, available everywhere. And yeah, that's what we've been working on for a long time. You can also find some of my writing at Natural Selections at Substack. We do DarkHorse weekly with our live streams. And what else?
I don't know.
That's a lot. Yeah,
that's a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot of stuff.
We will have links to all of those down in the description. Thank you both so much for making the time, for joining us. It's both, listening to you, thinking about mindsets and more. It's helped me immensely. So deeply appreciate both of your work, and thanks again.
Thanks to you both.
so
It was
much.
a great discussion.